Part 1. 8 Quality Characteristics. Are there distinctive quality characteristics which are more developed in growing churches than in those which are not growing? And could it be that developing these quality characteristics is the, quote, key to success, end quote, in growing churches? And beyond that, a more helpful approach than the pragmatic question, how do we get more people to come to church? This has been the focus of our research. The results put into question much of what until now has been marketed to us as church growth principles. Demythologizing church growth. A look at church growth literature can be confusing. An entire array of programs claim, do what we do and you will get the same results. Unfortunately, many of these concepts contradict one another. One group pushes megachurches as the most effective way to reach a community with the gospel, while another suggests that the optimal church size is a small group, almost like most home Bible studies. Some suggest that the key to success is a worship service targeted towards non-Christians, while others emphasize that the goal of a worship service is exclusively worshiping God and equipping the saints. One group is convinced that marketing strategies must be integrated into church planning, while another enjoys healthy church growth without even having heard of such methods. It appears to me that past discussions have been made too little distinction between models, equal concepts, with which some church in part of the world has had a positive experience, and principles equals that which applies to every church everywhere. Thus, some models parade as universally valid principles. At the same time, proven principles with universal application are sometimes mistaken for one model among many. I have attempted to illustrate the difference between these two approaches in the diagram. When I talk about following a model, I mean a church's attempt to transfer the methods of a single successful church, most often a megachurch, to its own situation. This approach is especially fascinating because to a certain extent, the vision one hopes to realize for one's own church is already visible in real life in the model church. The principle-oriented approach is different. It also assumes that model churches have much to teach us. Yet rather than limiting itself to one extraordinary model, hundreds of model churches, both large and small, are researched to discover which elements turn out to be universal principles that are relevant for all churches, and which elements are perhaps interesting factors but not generally valid principles for effective church growth. The principles are obtained by abstraction, i.e., by stripping the observable models of all of their specific local and cultural flavor. In a second step, the principles thus gained are individualized for the concrete situation of a specific church. This sometimes cumbersome principle-oriented approach, abstraction followed by individualization, is less attractive for some than the simple one-to-one imitation of a successful church model. Natural church development is a principle-oriented approach. There is nothing wrong with being inspired by a model church. However, if we want to go beyond enthusiasm to the transfer of reproducible elements, we must seek to discover the universal principles that are the basis for every kind of church growth. Learning from growing churches means analyzing their practices to discover the universals. This means more than simply adopting the explanations church leaders often present as the key to success. I have learned each of the principles presented in this book from growing churches, and interestingly enough, often from churches that would reject, quote, our approach to church growth. It may be that these churches would perceive their, quote, success in a completely different fashion, would use an entirely different jargon, and have never heard of the principles of natural church development. Yet, it can be demonstrated that they work and minister consciously or unconsciously according to these principles. the International Research Project. How does one discover universally applicable church growth principles? Answering this question is not a matter of intuition, nor of studying a limited number of model churches. There really is only one way to find an answer to this question, namely, scientifically sound research of churches around the world. This realization provided the framework for our initial research project in order to accumulate a sufficiently large database to make churches in all 6 continents was required. The realization provided the framework for our initial research project. In order to accumulate a sufficiently large database to make scientifically significant assertions, a minimum of 1,000 different churches on all 6 continents was required. We needed large and small, growing and declining, persecuted and state-subsidized, charismatic and non-charismatic, prominent models, and entirely unknown churches. We needed a cross-section of churches and a region where spiritual awakenings are occurring, such as Brazil or Korea, as well as areas in which, in light of worldwide standards, qualify more as, quote, spiritually developing nations, such as Germany. This study developed into the most comprehensive research project of the causes of church growth ever undertaken. Originally, churches from a total of 32 countries participated. The survey questionnaire, which was to be completed by 30 members from each participating church, was translated into 18 languages. Since then, we have accumulated data from 45,000 churches, representing 70 countries. More than 170 million individual answers have been evaluated. While the graphics found in this book represent the results of the initial research among 1,000 churches, all of these results have been repeatedly confirmed in the increased database. Why all the effort? What motivated this massive endeavor was the realization that without such thorough research, it would be impossible to decide which of the modern principles of success are universally applicable and which are simply myths. Much of what is often matter-of-factly assumed to be a principle of church growth was shown by our research to be nothing more than the pet idea of a certain pastor. Such ideas, which are deducted from the personal experiences of one author, are not necessarily wrong. We can learn much from them. They are, however, not to be confused with universal church growth principles. One of the most important criteria for our research project was a high scientific standard. Christoph Schalk, a social scientist and psychologist, agreed to coordinate the project and serve as its scientific advisor after having identified several weaknesses in the testing procedures we had used previously. He drafted a new questionnaire with rigorous standards for objectivity, reliability, and validity, and used approved methods from social science for the analysis of the data. This project is actually the 5th stage in a series of research projects begun in 1986 in German-speaking Europe. Although the methodology may have left much to be desired in previous years, we gained an initial understanding of church growth principles upon which the subsequent studies were based. To my knowledge, our research provides the first worldwide scientifically verifiable answer to the question, what church growth principles are true, regardless of culture and theological persuasion. We strove to find a valid answer to the question, what should each church and every Christian do to obey the Great Commission in today's world? Is growth the appropriate criterion? There is an unspoken assumption within the church growth movement that growing churches are automatically good churches. But is this question accurate? We can find a great variety of statements on this subject in church growth literature, but in the end, there are no more than opinions and hunches. The reason is simply that while quantitative growth in a church, size as well growth rate, could be measured with a certain degree of accuracy, a reliable procedure for measuring qualitative growth with objective, demonstrable criteria was not yet available. Our efforts between 1986 and 1996 focused on developing this kind of evaluative instrument for churches. Having concluded our international research, we now have a procedure by which any church can determine its quality index, QI. This is based on 8 quality characteristics described on the following pages. For details, see pages 40 through 41. The diagram on page 23 shows that in terms of the relationship between quality and quantity, 4 distinct categories of churches are identifiable. A. Top right quadrant. Churches with above average quality, QI over 56, mean the mean of all above average growing churches, and above average quantitative growth in worship attendance, 10% or more per year over a period of 5 years. B. Top left quadrant. Churches with above average quality but with diminishing worship attendance. C. Bottom left quadrant. Churches with below average quality, QI, less than 45, the mean of all declining churches, and diminishing worship attendance. D. Bottom right quadrant. Churches with below average quality and above average worship attendance. With the insights gained from our research, we can finally quit speculating about these 4 types of churches. We have documented real-life examples on the following pages. I will be using the matrix of 4 diagram, see graphic on page 22, in order to illustrate the day-to-day reality of church life in these 4 categories. The explanations provided will help you understand what kind of church each bar represents as you look at the graphics throughout this book. When you encounter the matrix of 4 diagram on the following pages, please do not assume that we surveyed only churches representative of these 4 categories in order to test the validity of our proposed principles. In order to determine which questions were the best indicators for the quality and growth potential of a church, we evaluated all of the churches that participated in the project, not only those that fit into the categories on the diagram. However, the answers given by churches falling into those 4 specific categories, in my opinion, communicate most clearly the practical significance of the principles behind the questions. Quality characteristic number 1. Empowering leadership. Church growth literature on the topic of leadership typically states that the leadership style of pastors in growing churches is more project than people-oriented, more goal than relationship-oriented, more authoritarian than team-oriented. In their search for models worth imitating, some authors probably gravitate more toward large churches which tend to employ this kind of leadership than growing churches. The 2, however, are far from being the same, as we shall see pages 48 to 50. Our research produced results different from what existing church growth literature, including my own writings, would have led us to expect. While it is correct that goal orientation is an important leadership trait, it is interesting to observe that this is not an area where leaders of growing and non-growing churches differ greatly. Our study demonstrated that while pastors of growing churches are usually not, quote, people persons who lose themselves in interaction with individuals, yet on the average they are somewhat more relationship, person, and partnership-oriented than their colleagues in declining churches. See graphic below. The real difference. The key distinction is probably best expressed by the word empowerment. Leaders of growing churches concentrate on empowering other Christians for ministry. They do not use lay workers as, quote, helpers in attaining their own goals and fulfilling their own visions. Rather, they invert the pyramid of authority so that the leader assists Christians to attain the spiritual potential God has for them. These pastors equip, support, motivate, and mentor individuals, enabling them to become all that God wants them to be. If we take a closer look at this process, we understand why these leaders need to be both goal and relationship oriented. The polarity, which will be explained as theological paradigm of natural church development in Part 4, must be incarnated in the personality of the leader. What we encounter here was referred to in the introduction as all by itself principle. Leaders who realize their own empowerment by empowering others experience how the, quote, all by itself principles contribute to growth. Rather than handling the bulk of church responsibilities on their own, they invest the majority of their time in discipleship, delegation, and multiplication. Thus, the energy they expend can be multiplied indefinitely. This is how spiritual self-organization occurs. God's energy, not human effort and pressure, is released to set the church in motion. The research data call into question a tendency in church growth literature to illustrate leadership principles with examples from megachurches. In many instances, their materials showcase ingenious leaders who are so gifted that it is unrealistic to refer to their churches as, quote, reproducible models. Now, for the good news, pastors of growing churches do not need to be superstars. Most of the pastors with the highest scores in our survey are little known. They generally provide us, however, with more helpful basic leadership principles than most of the world-famous, quote, spiritual superstars. It is obvious that the leadership model depicted here is popular with neither technocrats nor spiritualists. Technocrats tend to gravitate more towards a, quote, guru who can be either a classical cleric or a reverend and aloof church growth manager. In contrast, spiritualists tend to have difficulty submitting to any form of leadership. Quality characteristic 2, gift-based ministry. The quality characteristic gift-based ministry demonstrates particularly well what we mean by all-by-itself growth. The gift-based approach reflects the conviction that God sovereignly determines which Christians should best assume which ministries. The role of church leadership is to help its members identify their gifts and to integrate them into appropriate ministries. When Christians serve in their area of giftedness, they generally function less in their own strength and more in the power of the Holy Spirit. Thus, ordinary people can accomplish the extraordinary. An interesting corollary result of our research was the discovery that probably no factor influences the contentedness of Christians more than whether they are utilizing their gifts or not. Our data demonstrated a highly significant relationship between gift orientation, my personal ministry involvements match my gifts, and joy in living. Quote, I consider myself to be a happy, contented person, end quote. None of the 8 quality characteristics showed nearly as much influence on both personal and church life as gift-based ministry. This is why it doesn't surprise me that the discipleship resource we have developed for this quality characteristic, the 3 colors of ministry, has by far had the best reception of all of the church growth materials that we have developed. Here, church growth is not merely a topic for a few church strategists. It is a crucial element for the life of each and every Christian. Spiritual gifts and the priesthood of all believers. Unfortunately, in recent years, some have misunderstood the gift-based approach as just another passing church growth fad. But the discovery and use of spiritual gifts is the only way to live out the Reformation watchword of priesthood of all believers. How can this be achieved when Christians do not recognize even their God-given gifting and calling? According to a survey we conducted among 1,600 active Christians in German-speaking Europe, 80% could not identify their gifts. This appears to me to be one of the primary reasons why the, quote, priesthood of all believers, end quote, has, for the most part, never been achieved in the lands of the Reformation. Resistance to the gift-based approach grows out of the false theological paradigms which persistently stifle and restrain much of Christianity. Technocratic thinkers tend to dictate which ministry laypersons should assume, and then search eagerly for volunteers to fulfill their vision. Should they not find any volunteers, they apply pressure. People must conform to their leaders' preconceived framework. In contrast, spiritualists often resist fitting their gifts into an established plan, since they are hostile towards church structures in general. From their point of view, it wouldn't be truly spiritual. In addition, many of these spiritualists identify spiritual gifts exclusively with the extraordinary, spectacular, or supernatural, which of course keeps the gifts from being included in the church growth planning process. Two of the 10 questions with which we calculated in the quality index for gift-based ministry. The question about the, quote, use of gifts on the left makes a difference particularly evident between above and below average churches. Of all of the variables associated with this quality characteristic, the question on, quote, lay training, end quote, right, has the greatest correlation with church growth. Quality characteristic 3, passionate spirituality. Our research indicated clearly that church development is dependent neither on spiritual persuasions, such as charismatic or non-charismatic, nor on specific spiritual practices, such as liturgical prayers or, quote, spiritual warfare, end quote, etc., which are cited by some groups as the cause of church growth within their ranks. The point separating growth and non-growing churches, those which are qualitatively above or below average, is a different one, namely, quote, are the Christians in this church on fire? Do they live committed lives and practice their faith with joy and enthusiasm? End quote. Since there are significant differences in this area between growing and declining churches of various spiritual cultures, we called this quality characteristic, quote, passionate spirituality, end quote. The concept of spiritual passion and the widespread notion of the walk of faith as performing one's duty seem to be mutually exclusive. We noticed that in churches which tend towards legalism, where being Christian means having the right doctrine, moral code, church membership, etc., spiritual passion is usually below average. Quality instead of quantity. The nature of this quality characteristic becomes evident by examining the prayer life of the Christians surveyed. While the amount of time, quantity, a Christian spends in prayer plays only a minor role with regard to the quality and growth of a church, whether prayer is viewed as an, quote, inspiring experience, end quote, or not, has a significant relationship on the quality and quantity of the church, diagram left. Similar results were found with respect to personal use of the Bible and other factors affecting personal spirituality. This quality characteristic has been widely criticized in the past. Quote, passion alone is no reflection of one's loyalty to the truth, end quote. Even sects, so the argument goes, are characterized by great enthusiasm. This observation is true, of course. I have not yet researched the causes for growth among sects, but I suspect that their enthusiasm is likely a main reason for the impressive growth that some of these groups experience. This in no way validates the theological truth of their claims. Their doctrine remains theologically false despite their enthusiasm and successful numerical growth. On the other hand, quote, pure doctrine, end quote, alone, as countless examples illustrate, does not induce growth. A church, regardless of how orthodox its dogma and view of Scripture, can hardly expect to experience growth. As long as its members do not learn to live their faith with contagious enthusiasm, to share it with others. Wherever a defense of orthodoxy replaces the expression of a passionate faith in Christ, a false paradigm is at work. On such ideological ground, rigid fanaticism and no truly liberated passion will flourish. The quality characteristic, quote, passionate spirituality, end quote, demonstrates empirically the theological core of the matter in church growth, the life of faith as genuine relationship with Jesus Christ. Quality characteristic 4, effective structures. Interestingly enough, quote, effective structures, end quote, prove to be by far the most controversial of the 8 quality characteristics. The false paradigms which consciously or unconsciously influence most Christians are especially harmful in this area. Spiritualists tend to be skeptical of structures, deeming them unspiritual, while those from the technocratic camp mistake certain structures for the very essence of the Church of Jesus Christ. The traditionalists among them are more threatened by the adjective, quote, effective than the noun structures. Effectiveness is to them an untheological, pragmatic, and unspiritual criterion. Our research confirmed for the first time an extremely negative relationship between traditionalism and both growth and quality within the church. See diagram on page 31. The real difference. The evaluation of the data from churches on all continents was particularly interesting with regard to this quality characteristic. Despite the vast differences in structures from church to church within various denominations and cultures, those with a high quality index have certain basic elements in common. One of the 15 sub-principles comprising the quality characteristic, effective structures, is the department head principle. See diagram below left. I have chosen this sub-principle because it typifies the core of this quality characteristic, the development of structures which promote an ongoing multiplication of the ministry. Leaders are not simply to lead, but also to develop other leaders. Anyone who accepts this perspective will continually evaluate to what extent church structures improve the self-organization of that church. Elements not meeting this standard, such as discouraging leadership structures, inconvenient worship service times, demotivating financial concepts, will be changed or eliminated. Through this process of continual structural self-renewal, traditionalistic ruts can, to a large extent, be avoided. One of the biggest barriers to recognizing the significance of structures for church development is the widespread view that structure and life are opposites. Interestingly enough, biological research reveals that dead matter and living organisms are not distinguished by their substance, as some people might think, but by the specific structure of the relationship of the individual parts to each other. In other words, in God's creation, the living and non-living, the organic and non-organic, are formed from identical material substances and are distinguished only by their structure. This intimate connection between structure and life was first expressed at creation. The act of creation was an act of forming and shaping. The opposite of form, which is the unformed earth, the amorphous mass, the lump of clay, wherever God breathes his spirit into formless clay, both life and form spring forth. A comparative creative act occurs whenever God pours out his spirit within the church today, and thus giving it structure and form. Quality characteristic 5, inspiring worship service. What is the common element that distinguishes the worship services of growing and declining, above and below average churches from one another? In other words, what should every church take into consideration in planning worship services? There is probably no area of church life in which the important distinction between, quote, models and principles, end quote, see pages 18 through 19. It is so frequently ignored. Countless Christians believe that they must adopt certain worship models from other churches because they supposedly represent a particular church growth principle. Our research shed some empirical light on the fog around the current discussion about worship services. Consider this example. Many Christians are convinced that a church service which primarily targets the unchurched, quote, seeker service, end quote, marvelously modeled by Willow Creek Community Church and others, is a church growth principle. I have spoken with numerous pastors who are in the process of changing their worship services into, quote, seeker services, end quote, without ever having investigated whether the specific form of evangelism is appropriate for their context. For it is just one of the many good approaches, they assume, however, that the seeker service is a universal principle. Yet it can be demonstrated that it is not. The seeker service in light of research. In order to select those churches that take a, quote, seeker orientation, end quote, seriously, we must select all churches which reported a very strong orientation towards reaching non-Christians in their worship services. We found that this position was not typical of any single category of churches, neither growing nor declining, neither qualitatively above average nor qualitatively below average. See the left diagram on page 33. It doesn't mean that the so-called, quote, seeker services, end quote, are not a wonderful evangelistic method that a church might consider emulating. It simply means that this form of evangelism cannot be classified as a church growth principle. Services may target Christians or non-Christians in their style. Services may target Christians or non-Christians. Their style may be liturgical or free. Their language may be, quote, churchy or, quote, secular. It makes no difference for church growth. A different criterion proved to be the deciding factor, namely, quote, is the worship service an inspiring service for the participants, end quote. See diagram above right. The answers to the 11 questions we asked churches about worship services all pointed in the same direction. It is this criterion which demonstrably separates growing churches from stagnant and declining ones. The word inspiring deserves clarification. It is to be understood in the literal sense of inspirito, and it means an inspiredness which comes from the Spirit of God. Whenever the Holy Spirit is truly at work, and his presence is not merely presumed, he will have a concrete effect upon the way a worship service is conducted, including the entire atmosphere of a gathering. People attending to truly, quote, inspired services typically indicate that going to church is fun. Knowing this, the likely source of opposition to this quality characteristic becomes evident. Christians who go to church to fulfill their Christian duty. These people do not attend church because it is a joyous and inspiring experience, but to do the pastor or God a favor. Some even believe that their, quote, faithfulness is enduring such a boring and unpleasant services will be blessed by God. Those who think this way will always tend to pressure other Christians to attend church. They have failed to comprehend the divine, quote, all by itself, end quote, growth which is particularly evident in worship services. When worship is inspiring, it draws people to the services all by itself. The spiritualistic paradigm has a negative effect on worship services too. Spiritualism suggests that real spirituality occurs exclusively in the, quote, inner person. Such factors as a tasteful place of worship, a well-organized greeting team, a competent moderator, or a meaningful order of worship are unimportant for spiritualists, or arouse the suspicion that they might contribute to the externalizing of the faith. Quality characteristic 6, holistic small groups. Our research in growing and declining churches all over the world has shown that continuous multiplication of small groups is a universal church growth principle. Furthermore, it has also disclosed what life in these small groups should be like if they are to have a positive effect on both quality and numerical growth within a church. They must be holistic groups which go beyond just discussing Bible passages to applying its message to daily life. In these groups, members are able to bring up those issues and questions that are immediate personal concerns. Holistic small groups are the natural place for Christians to learn to serve others, both in and outside of the group, with their spiritual gifts. The planned multiplication of small groups is made possible through the continual development of leaders as a byproduct of the normal group life. The meaning of the term, quote, discipleship, end quote, becomes practical in the context of holistic small groups. The transfer of life, not rote learning of abstract concepts. Small groups or worship services. One result of our research is highly provocative. We presented the following statements to the pastors we surveyed. Is it more important for us that someone be involved in a small group than attend church? We asked them to indicate the response that best described the situation in their church. The diagram at the bottom left illustrates the same answer, quote, no, was found in both growing and declining, in qualitatively above average and below average congregations. We can be sure that this is not a church growth principle and therefore does not determine the quality index of a church. It is a radical fringe position. And yet, if we take a closer look at the results, we notice that this, quote, radical fringe position is much more common in churches with above average quality than in churches with below average quality. This means that there is a greater tendency to give small groups priority over worship service attendance, in itself a strange alternative. In churches with a high quality index and churches that are growing numerically, this still does not make the priority of small groups over worship services a church growth principle, for a principle is something that a church should not neglect under any circumstances. Nonetheless, it allows us to infer the level of importance given to small groups in growing churches. They are not a supplement, like a nice but dispensable hobby. No, much of the essence of true church life is worked out in small groups. Our research confirms that the larger a church becomes, the more divisive the small group principle will be with respect to her further growth. After we had processed all survey answers, we calculated which of the 170 variables had the most significant relationship to church growth. It is probably no coincidence that our computer survey selected this variable in the area of holistic small groups. Our church consciously promotes the multiplication of small groups through cell division. See diagram in the top right. If we were to identify any one principle as the most important, even though our research shows that the interplay of all basic elements is important, then without a doubt it would be the multiplication of small groups. Small groups, the pillars of church growth. In order to give proper weight to the strategic importance of small groups, we have conceptualized nearly all of our church growth materials so that they can be used in small group contexts. We found that there is an enormous difference, for example, between church leadership discussing evangelism, quote, loving relationships, or, quote, gift-based ministry in its staff meetings, and having each Christian integrated into a small group go through a process in which he or she experiences the meaning of these terms practically expressed in the life of the group. Quality characteristic 7. Need-oriented evangelism. Hardly any aspect of church growth is as riddled with cliches, dogmas, and myths as the area of evangelism. This is true of those who view evangelism with skepticism, as well as those who have made it their life calling. Most discussions about this topic have blurred the distinction between methods of evangelism that may have been used successfully by one or many churches and true principles of evangelism, which apply without exception to every church. Unfortunately, evangelism research has limited itself to determining the effectiveness of individual evangelism programs. Without a doubt, this research can determine the, quote, success of such events, but it cannot show whether or not they represent universal principles. Compare pages 18 through 19. Whenever a successful program is automatically presumed to be a church growth principle, a widespread Christian pastime, it causes tremendous confusion. Every Christian an evangelist? Our research disproves a thesis commonly held in evangelistically active groups that, quote, every Christian is an evangelist, end quote. There is a kernel of empirically demonstrable truth in this saying. It is indeed the responsibility of every Christian to use his or her own specific gifts in fulfilling the Great Commission. This does not, however, make him or her an evangelist. Evangelists are only those to whom God has given the corresponding spiritual gift. In one of our previous studies, we confirmed C. Peter Wagner's thesis that the gift of evangelism applies to no more than 10% of all Christians. Who has the gift of evangelism? We must distinguish between Christians gifted for evangelism and those whom God has called otherwise. If indeed all Christians are evangelists, then there is no need to discover the 10% who really do possess the gift. In this way, the 10% with the gift of evangelism would be significantly under-challenged, while the demands of the 90% without the gift would be too great. This is rather frustrating and very technocratic model. Our research shows that in churches with a high quality index, the leadership knows who has the gift of evangelism, see diagram on page 37, and directs them to a corresponding area of ministry. It is the task of each Christian to use his or her gifts to serve non-Christians with whom one has a personal relationship to see to it that they hear the gospel and to encourage contact with the local church. The key to church growth for the local congregation is to focus its evangelistic efforts on the questions and needs of non-Christians. This, quote, need-oriented approach is different from, quote, manipulative programs, end quote, where pressure on non-Christians must compensate for the lack of need orientation. It is particularly interesting to note that Christians in both growing and declining churches have exactly the same number of contacts with non-Christian, an average of 8.5 contacts. Challenging Christians to build new friendships with non-Christians is most certainly not a growth principle. The point is rather to use already existing relationships as contacts for evangelism. In each of the churches we surveyed, including those that lamented having little or no contact with the world, the number of contacts outside the church was already large enough, so there was no need to emphasize developing new friendships with the unchurched. Quality characteristic 8. Loving relationships. Some years ago, when we published materials to help individuals, groups, and entire churches learn how to express Christian love, some specialists said that these were not, quote, church growth materials, end quote. Yet our research indicates that there is a highly significant relationship between the ability of a church to demonstrate love and its long-term growth potential. Growing churches possess on average a measurably higher, quote, love quotient, end quote, than stagnant or declining ones. To determine this love quotient, we asked, among other things, how much time members spent with one another outside of official church-sponsored events. For example, how often do they invite one another for meals or a cup of coffee? How generous is the church in doling out compliments? To what extent is the pastor aware of the personal problems that the lay workers in the congregation? How much laughter is there in the church? 2 of the 12 variables which comprise the love quotient are pictured in the diagrams on page 39. We found that these issues, which some strategists discounted as irrelevant, contain important church growth principles. To put it even more pointedly, whereas a, quote, seeker service cannot be called a church growth principle any more than an evangelistic crusade, or the practice of spiritual warfare, as valuable as they may be. It can be demonstrated that there is a significant connection between laughter in the church and that church's qualitative and numerical growth. It is interesting that such a significant factor, which according to the data definitely has the status of a church growth principle, receives almost no mention in church growth literature. Unfeigned practical love has a divinely generated magnetic power far more effective than evangelistic programs, which depend almost entirely on verbal communication. People do not want to hear us talk about love. They want to experience how Christian love really works. The more technocratic a church, the more difficulties it will have in living out the Christian commandment to love. Since the technocratic paradigm understands faith primarily as the fulfillment of dogmatic and moral standards, it produces a deficit among Christians in their ability to love. The spiritualistic paradigm is just as detrimental in its effect on a church's love potential, in contrast to the biblical definition of love as fruit, action, or deed. These churches espouse a rather secular concept of love. Love is viewed as a feeling which overwhelms you, if you're lucky, and then disappears just as mysteriously. According to this perspective, it's impossible to empirically measure out the love potential of a church, and all planned efforts to increase this potential are considered useless from the start. It is interesting to note that the most frequent, quote, minimum factor of churches with more than 1,000 in attendance is the quality characteristic, quote, loving relationships. But wherever there is a lack of love, further church development is severely hampered. No quality characteristic may be missing. The real challenge of our international research project was to develop an empirical method for measuring the 8 quality characteristics, which had already proved to be relevant to church growth in our pre-studies, and for comparing them to one another. We developed numerous questions corresponding to each of the 8 areas, which among other things were to fulfill the following 2 criteria. A. They had to show an empirically demonstrable connection, factor, and item analysis to the other questions on the same scale equals the same quality characteristic. B. They had to show a demonstrably positive correlation to the quantitative growth of the church, criteria validity. In each of the countries we surveyed, the values we obtained were normed to a median of 50, i.e., the, quote, average church for each country had a quality index of 50 for each of the 8 characteristics. The result of the study was that growing churches clearly scored above the qualitative median in each of the 8 categories, and declining churches were similarly below the median. See diagram on page 41. It all depends on the interplay. Our research tells us that there is no one single factor which leads to growth in churches. It is the interplay of all 8 elements. No church wanting to grow qualitatively, and quantitatively can afford to overlook any one of these quality characteristics. For example, the widespread claim that church growth is exclusively a matter of prayer is simply not true. Such a statement absolutizes one element of the quality characteristic, quote, passionate spirituality, at the expense of all others. If this claim were true, it would mean that church development is possible without cultivating love, without making use of spiritual gifts, without evangelism. This viewpoint is not only empirically untenable, it is also contrary to Scripture, a false teaching. Much prayer but little love, few gifts and no evangelism? That would be strange indeed. Examples like this demonstrate once again the inherent contradictions of the, quote, spiritualistic paradigm. Neither small groups nor worship services, neither leadership nor structures, nor any other element is the, quote, key to church growth. The key is found in the harmonious interplay of all 8 elements. We should be wary of advice to follow someone's pet emphasis that excludes the other quality characteristics. Based on the data we compiled, we were for the first time able to empirically prove the following three theses. 1. The differences between growing and declining churches in all 8 quality areas are highly significant. Thus, growing churches have, on average, measurably higher quality. 2. There are, however, exceptions to this rule. Churches which grow numerically but have below average quality index, quantitative growth is apparently attainable by methods other than the development of the 8 quality factors, such as effective marketing, contextual factors, etc. There is one rule, however, for which we didn't find a single exception among the 1,000 churches originally surveyed. Every church in which a quality index of 65 or more was reached for each of the 8 quality characteristics is a growing church. This is one of the most revealing discoveries of our survey. The qualitative approach. The qualitative approach, as described in the previous sections, has tremendous significance for practical ministry. Our fundamental question is not, quote, how do we attract more people in our worship service, end quote, but rather, quote, how can we grow in the 8 quality areas, end quote. Behind this question is a solid conviction, both theologically and empirically founded, that genuine quality will ultimately positively impact quantitative growth. Our point of reference is natural church. Our point of reference in natural church development is not the outward manifestation of growth, such as increased worship attendance, but the spiritual and strategic causes behind them. As described by the 8 quality characteristics, the measurable results of natural church development, as described in the preface, pages 3-5, appear to me to be proof that the all-by-itself principle is more than a nice theory. It can be demonstrated that this principle really works. This shouldn't surprise us, since it is God-given. What we describe with imperfect words is nothing but a human effort to gain a better grasp of a divine principle. Quality produces quantity. On the basis of these empirically demonstrated facts, I am decidedly against the widespread church growth movement thesis, which states that developing quantity requires a different set of methods than developing quality. We now have every reason to come to the opposite conclusion. Precisely the same, quote, methods which produce higher quality will generate quantitative growth as a natural, quote, byproduct. In light of our survey, it seems very questionable to repeatedly take, quote, growing churches, a purely quantitative criterion, as a standard. On the previous pages, we have seen enough examples of, quote, growing churches of below average quality. These are churches in which most Christians do not recognize their gifts, where little love is practiced, where passionate prayer seldom occurs, where there is little enjoyment of one another and not much to laugh about. Yet they are growing. If, quote, growth indeed were the sole issue here, then we should turn to these churches to discover their, quote, recipe for success. Yet there is hardly anything to learn from them. I would even venture to say that we can learn much more from declining churches with above average quality, a rare phenomenon, than from growing churches with below average quality. If this sounds preposterous, I would recommend a quick review of the diagrams presented on pages 24-39, contrasting these two categories. This should convince even the strongest proponents of the quantitative approach that the orientation towards church quality is by far the more helpful point of departure. Some church growth specialists react very negatively to the qualitative approach because it has been misused in the past. Until recently, it was all but impossible to accurately measure the quality of church life. This allowed churches to have never experienced numerical growth to self-righteously refer to their supposedly high quality, which they presented as being far more important than numbers. This is no longer possible. Our research shows that the lack of quantitative growth in most cases indicates a qualitative problem. Above a certain qualitative level, there are no stagnant or declining churches at all. Why quantitative growth goals are inadequate. In many church growth books, we meet a stubborn myth. A church that wants to grow needs numerical growth goals such as, quote, by the year 2007, our worship attendance will have reached 3,400, end quote. If there is any one challenge that most of the Christian public identifies with the church growth movement, this is it. Yet our study revealed that only 31% of all above-average growing churches use such goals. In other words, 7 out of 10 fast-growing churches do without them, and apparently fare exceedingly well. See diagram. This statistic alone does not say much about the usefulness or harm of quantitative growth goals, but it does point out that we are not dealing with a universal church growth principle. The meaning of goals. So as not to be misunderstood, let me emphasize that I know of no growing church that can do without the motivating power of concrete goals. Churches need precise, challenging, time-bound, and measurable goals in order to progress in their development. But expressing such goals in terms of worship service attendance appears to me to be rather shallow. Just how should a statement such as, "In the near future, 3,400 worshipers will gather in our sanctuary," serve as a concrete source for motivation? Of course, one can marvel at the numbers, but it still does not motivate individuals to take concrete steps towards church growth. I think something basic has been overlooked here. Goals can only motivate people when they touch on areas which they can personally influence. The magic number of 3,400 is in and of itself hardly motivating, and a fixation on such figures can actually be counterproductive. For how can one little church member make any meaningful contribution? However, to become more loving towards other home group members, to cordially welcome guests at our worship services, to invite unchurched acquaintances over for coffee, to commit oneself to pray at a certain time each day, these are all attainable goals which members can personally influence. And isn't it interesting that a concentration on these qualitative areas demonstrably has a stronger relationship to church's growth than the supposedly important attendance goals? The distinction between what is humanly possible in a church, e.g., improving the quality of ministry, and what is not, e.g., increased attendance conversions. We will discuss this in more detail in Part 4, has a practical implications. We must make sure to set goals only in areas of human, quote, achievability, and not in areas that are beyond our control. Could it be that some of the church growth authors advocate worship attendance numbers as, quote, goals, because they quietly assume that this is actually humanly possible? As we have observed, this illusion is characteristic of the technocratic paradigm. Of course, it is not wrong, but rather very useful to track worship attendance and to analyze trends. It all depends upon the value assigned to the attendance statistics. Increased worship attendance is not the ultimate goal, with everything else being a means to that end. It is a natural byproduct of improved quality. This insight leads to an important conclusion. Because increased church attendance is the natural effect of higher quality, it follows that monitoring attendance can serve as a strategic instrument for, quote, success control. This instrument, along with other indices, helps us to find out whether our work on the quality of church life has borne fruit. As we have seen, increased worship attendance alone does not approve the quality of a church. Nevertheless, if a church experiences no quantitative growth whatsoever over the years, then it has every reason to seek the causes in clearly identifiable qualitative problems. The point of departure for natural church development is, therefore, not goal setting in the area of quantity, 3,400 in church by 2007, but in the area of quality. By the end of November, 80% of all regular worshiper attenders will know their spiritual gifts. In this area, we dare not to neglect setting challenging, attainable, time-bound, and measurable goals. How to set qualitative goals. What is a qualitative goal? To put it plainly, qualitative has nothing, quote, fuzzy about it. Qualitative goals are precise, time-bound, verifiable, measurable goals which relate to the increase of quality in a church. It is not a, quote, qualitative goal when a church member says, "I want to be a better Christian," or when a church declares, "In the future we want to relate to each other in a more loving and spiritual way." These are nice statements, but they are not goals. The box on the right has some examples of what is meant to be What is meant by qualitative goals? Continual quality increase. When we set goals, we need to do so in areas we can actually influence. This is the main reason why goals aimed at increased worship attendance figures are often counterproductive. See pages 44 through 45. In contrast, the quality of the 8 key areas of church life can definitely be affected by our work. What else, indeed, should be the goal of church planning if it's not continual increase of its quality? Should we leave it to chance whether Christians learn to discern their gifts or relate to each other in loving ways? Whether they have a time and place for spiritual sharing or find their part in fulfilling the Great Commission? What can I contribute? In my seminars, after the 8 quality characteristics have been discussed, I often ask, what would happen if the quality of each of those 8 areas would double within the next 12 months? Almost anybody who thinks about this question, even he or she who does not know the principles of natural church development in all detail, will realize that this would set off an enormous transformation process, which would deserve our full and passionate involvement. Then I ask, what can we do in each of the 8 areas in order to produce this quality increase? This question leads us right into the goal-setting process. The problem in many churches is that the leadership talks about all kinds of questions, but never tackles these concrete things the church should do. Plan for, pray about, and support to keep increasing the quality of church life in 8 areas mentioned above. Here's the chart. Area of ministry, examples of qualitative goals. Leadership. Quote, by the end of the year, our pastor will be released from 20% of his regular responsibilities in order to dedicate this time to the training of lay workers. Ministry. At the end of the 9 months, 80% of those attending worship services will have discovered their spiritual gifts, and 50% will be active in a ministry corresponding to their gifts. Spirituality. By February 1st, we will have decided which of the 3 lay workers under consideration will assume coordination of the prayer ministry. Structures. By the end of December of this year, we will have determined a point person for each of the 9 areas of ministry our church has established. Worship service. From the beginning of next year, we will have a worship service each quarter which is specifically designed to reach non-Christians. Small groups. Within the next 6 months, we will divide our home study with the co-leader as assuming the leadership of the new group. Evangelism. By the end of April, the church leadership will have identified which 10% of the Christians God has blessed with the gift of evangelism, and will have had a personal conversation with each one regarding this gift. Relationships. After having studied the, quote, 3 colors of love for 3 months, each home Bible study participant will agree with the statement, I am enjoying being part of this fellowship more than in the past. In this chart, you will find one example of a, quote, qualitative goal for each of the 8 quality characteristics. Please note that the examples are randomly chosen illustrations. There are no standard goals for all churches. Each church must set goals that promise the greatest possible progress in church development under their given circumstances. Are large churches, quote, good churches? Those familiar with church growth literature regularly encounter the names of a number of large churches which are held up as models to be imitated. The presupposition is that large churches are by definition good churches. Is this thesis tenable? Our research revealed for the first time that the opposite is probably true. I would like to describe step by step how we came to this conclusion during the course of our research project. 1. We sensed that there was something in it when we analyzed the data and compared the average membership and worship attendance figures of growing and declining churches. See the first of the 2 diagrams on the left. Declining churches averaged twice as many members as growing churches, and their worship attendance was on the whole 17% higher. 2. In another step, we checked on real growth rates in both large and small churches over the past 5 years, bottom left diagram. The average in smaller churches was 13%, whereas in larger churches it was a mere 3%. A statistically significant difference was also evident on the quality index. Large churches typically scored 2 points below the median of 50. Small churches 2 points above the median. Number 3. We then calculated which of the 170 variables that served as the basis for our survey that had the strongest negative correlation to church growth. The astonishing result: church size turned out to be the third strongest negative factor, on a par with factors like liberal theology and traditionalism. Number 4. In order to define large and small more precisely, we examined sets of churches of specific sizes. Those with 1 to 100 worshippers, 100 to 200, 200 to 300, and 300 to 400, and so forth. See diagram on page 49. The result? The growth rate of churches decreased with increasing size. This fact in and of itself came as no great surprise, because in large churches with percentages represent many, many more people. But when we converted the percentages into raw numbers, we were dumbfounded. Churches in the smallest size category had won an average of 32 new people over the past 5 years. Churches with 100 to 200 in worship also won 32. Churches between 200 and 300 averaged 39 new individuals. Churches between 300 and 400 won 25. So a, quote, small church wins just as many people for Christ as a, quote, large one. And what's more, 2 churches with 200 in worship on a Sunday will win twice as many new people as a church with 400 in attendance. Number 5. But couldn't it be that the picture is different for really large churches with more than 1,000 at worship services? Our huge reservoir of data enabled us to test this theory for the first time. Here are the results. While the smallest churches with an average attendance of 51 typically won 32 new people of the last 5 years, the megachurches with an average attendance of 2,856 won 112 new people during the same period. In raw numbers, a single megachurch won many more people than a single mini church. See diagram 50, page 50, top left. If we remember, though, that the megachurches are 56 times the size of the mini churches, then the following calculation expresses the potential of the 2 categories far more realistically. If instead of a single church with 2,856 in worship, we had 56 churches, each with 51 worshipers, these churches would statistically win 1,792 people within 5 years, 16 times the number the megachurch would win. Thus, we can conclude that the evangelistic effectiveness of many churches is statistically 1,600% greater than that of megachurches. Number 6. On nearly all relevant quality factors, larger churches compare disfavorably with smaller ones. Here are just 2 examples. In many churches under 100, 31% of all in attendance have, according to the pastor, an assignment corresponding to their gifts. In megachurches, this figure is a mere 17%. Diagram top right. In many churches, 46% of those who attend services have been integrated into a small group, whereas in megachurches, this is true of only 12%. The scenario is just as dramatic for nearly all of the 170 variables which we use to rate a church's quality. Rules and exceptions to the rule. Aren't there any examples which might demonstrate just the opposite? Churches which are large and at the same time growing numerically and characterized by high quality? Yes, there are such churches, and they are so unique, so exceptional, that they are the talk of the whole world. Quote, news is what is different. They are truly the exception to the rule, indeed quite spectacular exceptions. We should rejoice that these examples exist, yet we should avoid making these churches into models for others. It seems to me
to be far more hopeful to carefully examine the countless smaller churches manifesting high quality, strong growth, and innovative multiplication. If we need models at all, we should look for them in this category.